None of the missions had provided a blueprint for the moon's formation, but they had shown that it was as old as the Earth. It was made of the same rock, but it had no water, and it had once been completely molten. What could explain all these facts together? By the early 1970s, fresh ideas were emerging about the origins of all the planets. The early solar system was thought to have been a violent place, with many bodies growing rapidly and competing for space. These new theories led William Hartmann to look again at the evidence from the lunar missions. He came up with an intriguing idea for the moon's origin.
When the Earth was forming, it wasn't the only object at that distance from the sun. And the second biggest object actually got very big. And eventually, fairly late in the process, when the Earth was partly grown, crashed into the Earth and blew a lot of material out of the Earth. So the moon then grew from that debris swarm around the Earth.
Hartmann suggested that in its early history, the Earth had crossed paths with a world the size of Mars. Somehow, Earth survived the collision. The swirling mass of debris coalesced to form the moon. To many scientists, Hartmann's idea seemed almost too far-fetched to believe.
When I first heard about this theory that Bill Hartmann had put forward, my first reaction was almost shock. I didn't believe it. I was pretty sure that in a weekend I could do a few calculations and show that what they had proposed simply couldn't work. In fact, it took work with the biggest military computers to try to fill out the holes in this theory and begin to realize that really it could work after all.
The more people considered it, the more Hartmann's theory seemed to fit all the known facts about the moon. If it was born from the Earth, its rock would be the same. The heat of the collision explained why the moon was once entirely molten, and any water in its rocks had vaporized.
But as we've just demonstrated, there is indeed water in the moon rocks. Two objects colliding together would certainly have explained the identical materials, but how could water possibly have survived such a violent explosion?
Webb falsely accused me of cherry-picking titles that were convenient to my argument, but I can factually accuse him of the same thing. Webb showed us 3 different articles covering Sal's discovery. Here are some others. National Geographic, for example, titled their article, "Moon Water Found, Raises Questions About the Origin Theory." The Carnegie Institute of Science titled theirs, "Moon Water Discovered, Dampens Moon Formation Theory." This title was used nearly word for word by ScienceDaily.com. Evidence of water found deep within the moon, dampens moon formation theory. None of these articles that Webb show mention this doubt in their titles. But lower down in the Scientific American article, we are told,
"It's a little bit startling because you don't expect to find indigenous water in any lunar sample," says geologist Paul Sputus of the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston. Most researchers believe that the moon formed some 4.5 billion years ago, when a Mars-sized body smashed into Earth and knocked a piece of it loose, which became the moon. Lacking evidence of lunar water, most scientists have assumed that the collision vaporized any hydrogen capable of forming water, Saul says. People convinced themselves there was not water.
Alberto Saul and his team discussed this right at the beginning of the Nature article that Webb shows.
The moon is generally thought to have formed and evolved through a single or series of catastrophic heating events, during which most of the highly volatile elements were lost. Hydrogen, being the lightest element, is believed to have been completely lost during this period. Our results indicate that, contrary to prevailing ideas. The bulk moon might not be entirely depleted in highly volatile elements, including water. Thus, the presence of water must be considered in models constraining the moon's formation and its thermal and chemical evolution.
Talk about selective reading. Webb skips over explicit statements pointing out the newly discovered flaws with the lunar origin theory, and instead goes out of his way to find any article with the words lunar glass or beads in the title, so he can falsely accuse me of cherry-picking and changing the scope. He totally avoids mention of how this water hurts the deep impact theory. Hell, the blow to Hartmann's theory was even mentioned in the paragraph from the Space.com article I quoted. I mean, what else do you think they meant by statements like, "The discovery may force scientists to rethink the lunar past and future"? Later in the same article, we are told,
Scientists have long assumed the moon was dry because of its violent birth roughly 4.5 billion years ago. The leading theory holds that a Mars-sized planet smashed to Earth and tore off molten pieces that eventually formed into the moon. Most scientists thought that any water in the developing lunar body would have vaporized and been lost to space. If there was a lot of water in the early moon, then that is new for sure, said Ben Busey, a planetary scientist at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, who also was not involved in the new study. People will have to think about that when they think about how the moon evolved. The earlier thinking about the moon's lack of water meant researchers struggled to even get funding to search for counter-evidence. I thought that if we were really lucky, we would get to see it, said Alberto Sal, a geochemist at Brown University and lead author on the Nature study. Like everybody else, I was thinking our chances were low.
Ignoring this is another fallacy of omission by Phil Webb. And here's another one.
But as we've just learned, there is water in those rocks, meaning there is no big difference between moon rocks and Earth materials.
Of course, using this logic, you could say that there's no big difference between spaghetti and lima beans. They both contain water, don't they? Obviously, that's a wrong assumption. Jarrah's hasty conclusion that moon rocks are identical to Earth materials simply because they both contain water, or any single characteristic for that matter, is a fallacy of equivalence. And Jarrah uses this tactic boldly throughout his entire Exhibit D series.
There is no fallacy of equivalence. Here, Webb has created an omission and straw man hybrid, and the first of his many apples and oranges comparisons. The straw man is his claim that I say moon rocks and Earth rocks have no big differences simply because they both contain water. I said no such thing. I said that there is no big differences between the two because they both contain water and virtually the same chemical compositions and mineralogy. Webb knows that. It was in the statement I was replying to. As Mr. Craig41 told me over YouTube,
moon samples have a chemistry and mineralogy virtually identical to Earth materials, except for one big difference. They all lack any trace of contact with or alteration by water.
but as we've just learned, there is water in those rocks, meaning there is no big difference between moon rocks and Earth materials. His first apples and oranges fallacy is his spaghetti and lima beans analogy. Yes, both contain water, but neither have any similarities in compositions and minerals between the two. But the Apollo samples and their terrestrial cousins do. The Apollo samples have a chemistry and mineralogy almost identical to Earth rocks, and now it seems they also have water. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Evidently, the Apollo samples are of Earth origin, not lunar origin. But Webb goes on, claiming there is independent verification for water on the moon.
After Jarrah published his Exhibit D series, this Space.com article was updated to reflect the findings from the Cassini, Chandrayaan-1, and Deep Impact spacecraft, which have remotely detected the same signature of water, or at least hydroxyl, on the lunar surface that was originally detected in the Apollo moon rocks. Sadly, for Jarrah, this quantitative finding only serves to validate the Apollo moon rocks as having come from nowhere else but the equatorial region of the moon.
There are so many omission fallacies made in this one section that I don't know where to begin. Firstly, the Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft is not an independent space mission. It is a joint mission with NASA and the Indian Space Agency, ISRO. In fact, the instrument that supposedly detected this alleged water on the moon was specifically built by NASA. If we go to the September 24, 2009 Jet Propulsion Laboratory article, NASA instrument reveals water molecules on the lunar surface.
NASA's Moon Mineralogy Mapper, or M3 instrument, reported the observations. M3 was carried into space on October 22, 2008, aboard the Indian Space Research Organization's Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft.
This is essentially another fox guarding the henhouse scenario. It was NASA's instruments that allegedly found this water. I'm sure those instruments can tell you what NASA wants them to tell you. Ignoring this and passing Chandrayaan off as an independent verifier is another unjustified omission by Webb. Now, Chandrayaan-1 was launched after the Space.com article was published, and NASA's Deep Impact spacecraft flew by the moon in June 2009 during its extended mission, also long after this publication. But it also flew by the moon some 7 months prior to this Space.com article. And the other spacecraft that Webb mentions, NASA's Cassini probe to Saturn, long predates this article. How could NASA have known that someday scientists would confirm the existence of water in the lunar samples? This leads us to Webb's next omission. I have found many online articles and magazines that cover these discoveries by Deep Impact and Cassini, but all of them seem to have been published in September 2009 or sometime afterward. There were no articles from December 2007 covering Deep Impact's moon water detection at the time, nor were there any articles from 1999 covering Cassini's findings. This led us to wonder if NASA had even disclosed this information at the time. To find out, we contacted Jessica Sunshine of the University of Maryland, who heads Deep Impact Spectral Analysis, to ask whether these results from 2007 were released at the time, or if they were only made available in 2009. She sent us this response via her iPhone.
All data are in 2009 science paper.
It seems it is the same case with Cassini. In the same JPL article, we learn
the M3 team found water molecules in hydroxyl at diverse areas of the sunlit region of the moon's surface, but the water signature appeared stronger at the moon's higher latitudes. Water molecules in hydroxyl previously were suspected in data from a Cassini flyby of the moon in 1999, but the findings were not published until now.
How convenient! NASA's Cassini finds evidence of water in 1999 and Deep Impact in 2007. How interesting that they never decided to publish that information until shortly after the Apollo samples are confirmed to contain water. More likely what happened is that NASA invented a story to falsely validate the origin of their Apollo samples, as they have long been proven to contain water. Now, for a while, I suspected that this was the same case with the recent L-Cross impact, which NASA says kicked up 12 2-gallon buckets worth of water up into space. But then I realized something. Before we declare the Cassini, Chandrayaan-1 and Deep Impact data to be bullshit, let's have another look through the Space.com article that Webb shows. Webb claims this water, detected by unmanned probes, proves that the Apollo samples were collected from the equatorial regions of the moon.
Sadly, for Jarrah, this quantitative finding only serves to validate the Apollo moon rocks as having come from nowhere else but the equatorial region of the moon.
But if you actually read the article closely, you'll notice that this article discusses water detected in the polar regions of the moon. In fact, all the articles on this subject that I have read apply these findings to the lunar polar regions. The first sentence of the JPL article we looked at earlier explicitly states, NASA scientists have discovered water molecules in the polar regions of the moon.